An entire city built entirely over the sea has been standing for over a millennium on wooden foundations that, by all logic, should have rotted away centuries ago. No roads, no cars, just water canals weaving through 118 tiny islands connected by more than 400 bridges, where garbage trucks are boats, ambulances are speedboats, and the fire department arrives by water. This is Venice, and the engineering that keeps it from sinking into the muddy swamps it was built upon is so ingenious that modern architects still study it with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Here's what makes this genuinely mind-bending. The foundations holding up palaces, churches, and homes were driven into marshy ground 15 centuries ago using technology that wouldn't look out of place in ancient Rome. Millions of wooden pillars, an entire invisible forest, sit submerged beneath the city, and instead of decaying as wood normally does when wet, they've essentially turned to stone through a chemical process that still isn't completely understood. The entire city floats on what is essentially petrified timber, and it's been working perfectly for over 1,000 years. But Venice's survival story goes far beyond just not sinking. This is a city that had to solve problems no other civilization had faced. How do you get fresh drinking water when surrounded by undrinkable seawater? How do you handle sewage when there's no ground to dig sewers into? How do you fight fires when everything is surrounded by water but the buildings are still flammable? The solutions the Venetians engineered were so clever that some are still in use today, while others reveal uncomfortable truths about what's actually flowing through those romantic canal waters tourists pay €90 for 30-minute gondola rides through. Let's break down how Venice defied physics, geography, and common sense to become one of the world's most famous cities. The morning in Venice begins unlike anywhere else on Earth. At 7 a.m., boats replace buses at transportation stops. Wooden poles jutting from the water serve as parking spaces for watercraft. Commuters board water taxis that stop at various stations. Some passengers disembark, others climb aboard, all without a single automobile in sight. This isn't a tourist attraction or theme park. This is actual daily life for people who work in banks, cafes, and shops that happen to be built on islands. The oldest cafe in the world still operates here, over 300 years old, located in the middle of a public square where locals stand at the bar drinking espresso because sitting down to drink coffee is considered tourist behavior. Restaurants line the canals where you can eat mere feet from the water, watching boats pass while dining. One of the world's most famous opera houses sits built over the water. Even garbage collection happens by boat. Waste gets transported to the mainland, which is close enough to see but requires crossing water to reach. The entire rhythm of life revolves around water, bridges, and boats. The 176 canals connecting the islands require more than 400 bridges for pedestrians to cross, creating a maze of passages that tourists get lost in daily, while locals navigate by memory built from childhood. The most famous bridge is the Rialto, constructed in the 16th century and still one of Venice's most recognizable landmarks. The longest is the Liberty Bridge, stretching 3.85 kilometers to connect the historic city center to the Italian mainland. Most Venetians no longer live in the historic center. They've moved to the mainland and rent out their ancestral homes to tourists through modern platforms, charging €450 per night for houses overlooking canals that were built centuries before anyone imagined such a thing as tourism. This exodus of young people has transformed Venice from a living city into something increasingly resembling an open-air museum, where the ratio of tourists to actual residents grows more lopsided every year. But to understand why Venice exists at all, we have to go back 1,500 years to when the Western Roman Empire was collapsing and Hun tribes were invading northern Italy, destroying cities and slaughtering populations. Desperate refugees fled to the one place invading armies couldn't easily follow: the mosquito-infested marshlands and tiny muddy islands of the Venetian lagoon. These weren't islands in any conventional sense. They were marshy swamps barely rising above sea level, incapable of supporting any significant weight. Yet these refugees, with nowhere else to go, decided to build not just temporary shelters, but a permanent city. And somehow, impossibly, they succeeded. Here's the problem they faced: you cannot build on mud. Structures sink, foundations collapse, and any attempt at permanent construction fails. The Venetians solved this through a construction technique so innovative that modern engineers still marvel at its effectiveness. They imported strong timber, primarily from forests in Croatia, and drove these wooden pillars deep into the mud, approximately 5 meters down, until they hit a solid layer of compressed clay that could support weight. These weren't small posts. They were massive tree trunks, and they required millions of them. Beneath the famous Rialto Bridge alone, approximately 12,000 wooden pillars form the foundation. Larger buildings required even more. The Church of Santa Maria della Salute sits on over 1 million wooden pillars driven into the mud beneath it. After creating this forest of vertical pillars, workers placed horizontal wooden planks across the tops to distribute weight. Then came the crucial layer, Istrian stone, a type of water-resistant limestone from the Istrian Peninsula. This stone formed the actual base upon which brick and mortar structures were built. If every layer was constructed properly, the structure could last for centuries. And here's the genuinely strange part. It worked specifically because the wood stayed submerged in water. Normally, wood exposed to moisture rots rapidly due to fungal growth and bacterial decomposition. But wood completely submerged in oxygen-poor water undergoes a different process. Over centuries, minerals from the surrounding water and sediment gradually replace the wood's organic material through a process similar to petrification. The wood essentially turns to stone, not quite rock-hard, but far more durable than typical timber. This invisible forest of millions of petrified wooden pillars has carried Venice for over 1,000 years, and as long as they remain submerged and oxygen-deprived, they'll continue functioning indefinitely. But building foundations was only the first problem Venice had to solve. How do you get fresh drinking water when you're surrounded by seawater? The lagoon water isn't just salty, it's contaminated with waste and completely undrinkable. The Venetian solution was brilliantly simple. They dug large underground reservoirs called cisterns beneath public squares, sealed them with layers of clay to prevent saltwater seepage, and filled them with sand and gravel to act as natural filters. The square floors were cleverly engineered with a slight slope directing rainwater toward small openings. Rainwater would flow into these cisterns, filter through the sand and gravel layers, and collect as clean drinking water that could be drawn from wells. At Venice's peak, there were approximately 600 of these public wells, providing fresh water throughout the city. The system worked so effectively that it remained Venice's primary water source until the mid-20th century. Today, drinkable water is distributed through a modern pipeline system connected to the mainland, and the old wells have been preserved as decorative historical elements in the squares, though they no longer function. Now let's address the uncomfortable truth about Venice's canal water that tourism brochures don't emphasize. Venice doesn't have a centralized modern sewage system. The canals themselves are the sewers. In the 16th century, the city dug stone tunnels beneath streets called gattoli that carry wastewater directly into the canals. The tides, which rise and fall twice daily, are supposed to flush waste out into the lagoon and eventually the Adriatic Sea. In the 1990s, authorities began requiring sewage tanks beneath some buildings, but many older homes still discharge wastewater directly into canal water. This means that the romantic waterways tourists pay premium prices to ride gondolas through are, functionally, open sewers. During summer heat or low tide when water circulation decreases, the smell becomes quite noticeable, a fact locals are well aware of, but that catches tourists by surprise. The water quality in the canals is poor enough that swimming is officially prohibited, though enforcement is inconsistent and tourists occasionally jump in anyway, usually regretting it afterward. Venice's unique circumstances create other logistical challenges that require creative solutions. How do you fight fires when your fire trucks can't drive on roads because there aren't any? The Venice Fire Department operates specialized fireboats that can navigate the narrow canals and deploy firefighting equipment from the water. Emergency medical services work the same way. Ambulances are actually fast boats equipped with medical equipment that rush through canals to reach patients. Even moving furniture, construction materials, or basically anything larger than what a person can carry requires hiring a boat. Residents who need to move to a new apartment don't call a moving truck, they call a moving boat. Contractors renovating buildings transport materials by barge through the canals, navigating narrow passages where one wrong turn can result in damaged cargo or scraped walls. The Postal Service delivers mail by boat, police patrol by boat. Every single logistical function that other cities perform with vehicles, Venice performs with watercraft, creating a parallel civilization that operates on fundamentally different infrastructure than virtually anywhere else on Earth. But Venice faces existential threats that wooden foundations can't solve. The city is sinking, slowly but measurably. Ground subsidence caused by centuries of weight compressing the underlying soil combines with rising sea levels from climate change to create increasingly frequent flooding events called acqua alta, where water rises into streets and squares, sometimes flooding ground floor businesses and homes. The frequency and severity of these floods have increased dramatically in recent decades. In November 2019, Venice experienced its worst flooding in over 50 years, with water reaching 187 centimeters above normal sea level, causing hundreds of millions of euros in damage. In response, Italy completed the MOSE project, a system of mobile barriers that can be raised to block the lagoon entrances during high tide and storm surge events. The system has been deployed numerous times since becoming operational and has successfully prevented flooding that would have otherwise inundated the city. But MOSE is expensive to operate, requires constant maintenance, and is essentially a band-aid on a problem that will only worsen as sea levels continue rising. At some point, whether in decades or centuries, Venice may face the question of whether it can continue existing as a functioning city or must transition entirely into a preserved historical site, a museum of its own impossibility. The other existential threat is depopulation. Young Venetians increasingly move to the mainland where housing is affordable, jobs are more diverse, and daily life doesn't require navigating hundreds of bridges and paying premium prices for everything from groceries to plumbers who need boats to make house calls. The historic center's population has dropped from approximately 175,000 in the 1950s to around 50,000 today. As residents leave, properties get converted to tourist accommodations, which brings in revenue but accelerates the transformation of Venice from lived-in city to open-air theme park. There are entire neighborhoods where virtually every ground floor space is a restaurant, hotel, souvenir shop, or tourist service, and where actual residents are increasingly rare. Some argue that Venice is dying not from sinking but from tourism, that the very thing keeping it economically viable is destroying what made it special in the first place. Yet despite all these challenges and contradictions, Venice remains one of humanity's most remarkable achievements, a testament to human ingenuity, stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that something is impossible just because it's never been done before. Refugees fleeing invasion built an entire city on mud using wood that turned to stone, invented systems for fresh water and waste disposal that worked for centuries, and created an urban landscape so unique that nothing else on Earth resembles it. Beneath those romantic canals and Renaissance palaces sits an invisible forest of millions of wooden pillars, still holding strong after 1,000 years, defying rot and physics through a chemical transformation we still don't fully understand. Venice shouldn't exist, but it does. And that impossible fact is what continues drawing millions of visitors to walk its bridges and ride its canals, even if the water they're floating on isn't quite as clean as the postcards suggest.